Hey everybody, thank you for listening to the Mind Sculptors. I just want to say this right away. Last night I was having a little bit of an issue with my microphone, so my audio might sound a little weird. Everybody else sounds great, but mine might sound just a little strange. So keep that in mind and hope you enjoy the show. And welcome everybody in. This is the Mind Sculptors. I am your host Callahan, and boy do we have a great show lined up for you today. Joining me today are three of the most prolific duck builders in competitive Age. Joining me today, one of my friends from close here is Fenix, another good friend of mine, Cobblepott, and joining us today from Team Turn 3 is Pongo. Thanks you guys for coming in. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all on today. But we do have a lot for the four of us to talk about today. But before we get into it, I do want to address one small thing that I have one small mistake that I have made that a lot of people have pointed out to me is in my video on YouTube, I have misspelled sculptor as Sculptor. So I will be fixing that. I can't fix the videos. I can't go back in and do that, but I will be fixing thumbnails. So thank you to the people, including Cobblepott, who pointed that out to me.
Whatever we can do to help, that's...
Can't you just sculpt people's minds so that they don't notice the typo?
I had a friend who sent me, I saw that and I sent it to him, and he goes, it's Gaze the Tome Sculptor.
Right.
And I just thought it was hilarious.
Just say that it's gaslighting. It's correctly spelled, and that you're wrong.
It's been spelled right the entire time.
Right. What are you talking about?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Bernstein Bears situation.
We're gonna get another version of Jay's Chase the Gaslighter.
That's right.
Well, I really, honestly, I do appreciate everybody being able to come on and talk. And part of why I wanted to have everybody on, specifically you three, is I think it's very interesting. We all, specifically you three, I kind of got in on this, but you three more so than anybody else, independently all kind of started making these, it started off as Thrasios Timna and kind of evolved into Kenrith, these Kenrith Stax lists. Probably most famously on Twitter, people would see that as the Fairer Magic list by Cobblepott. And so I wanted to have you all on. So there's three deck lists specifically. Obviously there's Cobblepott's Fairer Magic, which is a pain in the ass to say, by the way, on radio or on podcast.
Yes.
There is Secret Commander Dan, or Dranith Magistrate, which is by Fenix, and then Pongo's yours is even harder to say over audio. King K Rule, but it's ROL for Rule of Law. So first we're going to start off right now. We'll actually just start off with Pongo. So Pongo, how did you come up with this idea at the beginning?
So essentially I remember it's a few weeks ago now. Everything feels so far away now. But the Archon of Emeria was spoiled. And I remember, everyone was freaking out because this card is absolutely absurd. Taking a Rule of Law and just stapling on sort of like the better part of Thalia, the newer Thalia, I should say,
right.
Heretic Cathar, and making it, it's one-sided naturally. Very, very strong card. And so this made me want to revisit sort of these old decks that I had worked on like a very, very long time ago. Even a little bit, certainly during the time that Flash was still legal, right. Well before we all kind of got fed up with that card, let's say. So basically this idea of having a Thrasios Timna Stax deck, using, sort of in a similar vein to a deck like Blood Pod, where you're leaning on Timna as a powerful card draw engine right. with your hate bear effects. This was really very much at the time inspired by the fact that I, played a ton of Derevi. Derevi to this day is one of my favorite commanders. And so I essentially wanted to address one of the biggest issues that Derevi has, which is she doesn't have black in her color identity. So, you know, having Thrasios and Timna to essentially, you know, get access to black with Derevi's color identity and that kind of game plan, you know, proved to be like a pretty popular idea, actually. And I remember, you know, quite a few people at the time were pretty excited about the deck. Shortly after that, Najeela was spoiled, and you know I became entirely obsessed with Najeela on the one hand, because listen, if there's one thing that's better than adding black to Derevi, it's playing Derevi as a win condition in a 5-color deck. So
not in a Stax way either.
Not even in a Stax way, no. But you know there's the additional issue, which is that Stax became, you know, increasingly untenable, because you know if you're going to try to slow down the game like that, and you know you now have this you know new bad B on the block who is really, really capable of taking advantage of that dynamic, and just beating face, you know, it becomes much, much harder to play that particular type of game plan, specifically like the classic Derevi game plan. You know, we can talk about whether or not that was in a good place to begin with anyway, but that's a whole other topic. So, you know, long story. I'm sorry for taking all this time, but basically, yeah. So I was interested in revisiting this idea, but at the same time, I was like, well, you know, like, how can I justify playing like more rule of law effects? Like, if I'm playing Thrasios and Timna, it's kind of more reasonable to want to be playing win conditions that win conditions that work ideally without rule of law in play. Things like Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation. It's really hard to justify pulling away from that game plan from an optimization perspective. So right. I was like, okay, well, I have to find a way to justify, at least to me, playing rule of law effects. And so I actually thought about, you know, tech that was being played in, you know, Mono White Heliod and in Lavinia as well. And I was like, oh, okay, well, we have combos with rule of law. You know, we can essentially assemble a hard lock by playing like a knowledge pool plus rule of law effect. Or Draneth Magistrate was the other really big card that got printed that really pushed that to the forefront. So I said, okay, well, this is the plan that I want to build around. Is you know, in particular the Lavinia like Draneth Magistrate locks, but also the fact, you know, that we can play these rule of law effects that also fit into the lock, and additionally that Flash is now banned. Rule of law is better positioned in the meta because everyone's playing Turbo Nas decks. So all these things coming together kind of prompted me to want to explore this direction, let's say.
Right. And you and Fenix started working on these kind of together, if I'm correct, about maybe a month or two ago. Because he would kind of share things with me in our group chat. And so next, I'll just kind of move it to Fenix because you kind of jump off of that. Where was it with you? You also are helped me do and run the Lavinia primers. So just kind of share some of where you were at.
Yeah, so Pongo, if I remember right, Pongo pinged me and was like, hey, you play Lavinia, what do you think of this deck list? And then I did what everyone does when they see a good deck and they steal it and then make it better. And so that's kind of where my Secret Commander Dan, which definitely has the least fun name, came from. And then at that point, it was running into the Lavinia and the Knowledge Pool locks, and then finding ways to win the game by casting no spells. Because Knowledge Pool and a Rule of Law doesn't let anyone cast any spells except for commanders. And so Kenrith then ended up coming from there, and some other discussions close to that.
Right. And that's interesting. So, and because we had kind of discussed, and it's a topic we're going to jump into here in a moment. So coming over to Cobblepott, you and I last Sunday did kind of talk a little bit about specifically how Fair Magic kind of evolved, all those things. But for those who haven't listened to that episode yet, if you haven't, you should. Just give us a brief recap, because your experience if I'm hearing this correctly, was very similar to Pongo's.
Right. So the original list was called Fair Magic, and it was a Thrasios and Timna list, kind of very similar to what Pongo was describing, but it was completely independent. And the idea was that that list came about while Flash was still legal, and it itself was a Flash Hulk list that made its the central premise of the list was to make it so that nobody could play Flash Hulk profitably. So the idea was, it started off as a meme because it ran Flash Hulk, but none of the Hulk piles won the game. They only put the game into completely untenable locks that nobody could win out of. So you would do a Flash Hulk and then put Archon of Valor's Reach onto the battlefield and name instant. And then, so everybody who was completely all in on either Flash or Ad Nauseam at the time was completely out of luck, and they weren't able to do anything from that. And the idea was that it also ran Chalice of the Void, Sanctum Prelate, and it ran mirror effects, so Phantasmal Image and Mirror Image, with the idea of either copying Sanctum Prelate, so you could say nobody can cast spells that are 1, 2, or 3, or you would copy Archon of Valor's Reach and say no one can cast instants, no one can cast sorceries, no one can cast enchantments, or something like that. And then the idea was you would win through creature beats, and it was a Thrasios and Timna list, so it had a very strong kind of Timna synergy with creature beats and so on. And it had, I think, similar spirit to what Pongo was talking about, where if it could have been done as a Derevi list, I probably would have started it there. But the tutors that are available for enchantments and kind of the lock pieces just aren't there in Bant, and access to the black tutors was kind of the thing that I wanted. And then what happened was, once Flash got banned and the meta shifted over to kind of everybody being on Consult and Oracle or on Turbo Nas, like we've kind of been saying here, Rule of Law does nothing to Flash Hulk, because you cast one spell and you win, so you don't need more than one spell.
You could argue it makes Flash Hulk harder
stronger
to deal with.
It does. Yeah. It does, because it makes it less likely that other people are going to be able to disrupt you. Or it makes it more powerful if you're able to get a Grand Abolisher or something like that into play as well.
Or you can do it on top of somebody else and all those things. Like, there's lots of different ways to do it.
All of those things. So with Rule of Law being better positioned, the idea was to kind of shift some of that technology kind of maybe away from just hard hating on all of the instant apparatus that people were running at that point, and getting more synergy from locking people down on Rule of Law, and then piling on top of that advantages for being able to break parity with a Rule of Law on the table. So we'll get into that, I think, in further discussion.
Right. And that's really interesting, because you all kind of got to this point where specifically Pongo and Cobblepott, where we moved from Timna and Thrasios, and I had tried, like, my experience, because I had tried a list like this maybe in January, where I was going, I want to try doing like 4-color Lavinia, and so I put it together. It was fine or whatever, and I just kind of tabled it after a while because Flash, and the move to Kenrith brings a lot to the table. And so really, if you would, Pongo, so what is it that Kenrith really brings to the table over Thrasios and Timna, two of the best, if not the best, commanders in the game?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I remember, and this kind of like goes back to when Fenix and I were like really discussing this list early on. Fenix was sort of coming at the list obviously with a lot of interest, because spiritually it's very similar to Lavinia. However, Phoenix's sort of big input was like, and this was also something I was grappling with as kind of an issue as well. Fenix mentions that, well, even after you assemble the lock, you have to kind of still win the game. And it turns out that when you get into that position, some commanders just end up being very problematic for you, and chief among them happens to be Kenrith, because Kenrith, first of all, you can cast things from your command zone even under the lock. Important point. But additionally, Kenrith brings several abilities that let you essentially break parity on these rule of law effects, because you get to spend your mana where other people don't get to spend their mana, other than casting their one spell a turn. Why are rule of law effects famously really, really bad in lower power formats? Well, because if somebody casts like a 9-drop spell, that's going to have a tremendous impact on the game, even if it's their one spell per turn. We're playing a bunch of lower impact, sort of more efficient spells. So part of breaking one way to break parity on that is to literally have 4 abilities or 5 abilities on tap that are going to let you spend all that excess mana that you might have drawing cards, pumping your commander to have a really powerful clock, being able to give him trample, and kind of importantly, like also being able to make other people draw cards, which is something I'm sure we'll come back to as an idea. So Kenrith was kind of like the natural transition, because we said, we have the 4 colors from Thrasios and Tymna, and like that's kind of important, which is fine. But like, how do we actually win the game? I think I like floated some truly awful tech to Fenix, like Pelucranos Unchained. If you can draw up to 8 cards and then like put him into, after discarding him, you like put him into play by escaping him, which can get around your knowledge pool lock. You can fight everything of importance on the board and have a 12/12 that you win with. Again, truly awful ideas. And I just said, well, listen, let's just play Kenrith. I think no point getting cute, no point trying to solve this problem in a sort of roundabout way. Let's just let's play the card that we don't want to see at the other end of the table.
Yeah, that's
to add a little bit of that as well. Being a Stax list, you really want to keep your hate pieces on the board, and kind of savvy players that are going to be playing against you are going to be kind of very surgical and trying to remove the selected pieces that you have, especially things like your Draneth Magistrate or Lavinia, and being able to have on tap a commander that is able to just kind of put those things right back into play, very selectively through its reanimation ability is really good, as well as giving you the haste ability for I think mine is the only list that runs Hermit Druid, but Hermit Druid is famously terrible if you don't have a way to give your Hermit Druid haste, because you're just telegraphing to everybody what it is that you're doing. So being able to get either a Hermit Druid or a Yisan or a Fiend Artisan or something like that requires a tap activation to get those into play and get value out of them before somebody else is able to react to them. The haste ability is very pertinent, and that was actually the main thing that pushed the Tymna and Thrasios away in favor of replacing it with Kenrith.
Yeah, and just to add on to all of those things, which I completely agree with, I think a lot of the experience from Lavinia and landing the Lavinia lock and then seeing which commanders are the worst to see across from the table is definitely where the idea came from. I mean, when you lock the table like that, the 3 worst commanders are definitely Kenrith, Najeela, and Yisan. And Yisan doesn't have any of the colors that we're really looking at in this case.
Right.
Godo's really bad against us,
Godo's
too.
also bad, yeah.
Because they don't care about really anything. They just want to attack.
Yeah. And so, speaking of, how Godo wins the game, Fenix, if you could for me, just kind of give me a rundown of what it is that these decks are doing. Because, you all have different kind of ways to doing it. But they all kind of have some overlapping pieces there. So what is it that this deck is really kind of doing? And then we could kind of touch on what our differences are there in a minute.
Yeah, so mine probably has the least amount of actual win conditions in it out of all the 3. The the first win condition is definitely making infinite mana, and then whatever way you're making infinite mana, whether that be MEL and dockside, etc. Finale of Devastation is a big one because it can give you X is equal to 10, pump all your creatures, kill everybody at the table, basically. The next one would be if you can get Kenrith out and get infinite mana, you can activate Kenrith's draw ability and target everyone at the table other than yourself and make them draw their decks. And then on mine, the last one would be I specifically have Sun Titan and I have Kenrith for when you're in those lock situations where you just repeatedly attack people.
Right. Well, and we kind of found that out through playtesting that a little bit, where I was playing specifically, I want to say it was an older version of Cobblepott's list, and I had Sylvan Safekeeper, Sun Titan out, and Dan, and once you get those out, it's really hard to get rid of the Sun Titan.
Yeah, at that point you're looking for Cyclonic Rift or maybe a Toxic Deluge, and that is only if those cards aren't protected.
Right.
By some sort of counterspell or something like that.
Right. Now, Cobblepott, with yours, you have the Finale of Devastation win. You have the Kenrith draw ability win. But you also are very uniquely playing Elesh Norn, Dovescape, and also Thassa's Oracle. Elaborate on that a little bit for me.
Sure. So the idea is that we want to be as kind of resilient to whatever it is that's happening on the table, and we want to be able to have a win even if for whatever reason we're not able to remove whatever it is that's keeping us from winning. So we've got different ways to generate infinite mana. The dockside way is going to be, requiring us to be able to ability to activate artifacts, for instance. So if there's a null rod effect, we can pivot and instead use Derevi and Gaia's Cradle and MEL to be able to do the same thing. Or if we don't have creature activations, Finale of Devastation is also a way to go through that. But we rather than just kind of putting all of our eggs in the basket of being able to generate infinite mana, I wanted to have kind of more sudden responses, or like I said, if you see a Hermit Druid on the table, people know exactly what's happening, and if you give them an opportunity to interact with it, they will take measures. Sometimes in the old days when Thassa's Oracle wasn't a thing and you had Lab Maniac, it was absolutely profitable to just play Lab Maniac naked out onto the board, because people would freak out about it and it would draw attention and people would spend their resources trying to interact with it when maybe that wasn't at all the thing that you were using. Like maybe you had a completely different plan online that you wanted to use to win. In this particular case, having a couple of different options that you can kind of situations that you can kind of emergently create to be able to interact with different situations that are happening on the board. Being able to say, I want to have a Hermit Druid so that I can have an Oracle line just in case something is keeping me from doing my infinite mana lines. I wanted to be able to have that just so that opponents need to be prepared for both possibilities. And so it just kind of gives you a greater surface area of ways to attack the table and to kind of not care if there's certain types of hate that are going to disrupt the line that you want to go through. Elesh Norn is there. So, Elesh Norn is a great hate piece just kind of in general. There's a ton of lines that just don't work at all if there's an opposing Elesh Norn for a lot of people. So just on its own, it does a lot of work. But in my particular list, having Dovescape be one of kind of the central, it's not a lock, but it's extremely difficult for most lists to weasel their way through if it ever resolves and gets onto the board. Dovescape creates this sub game where it becomes, all right, everybody tries to race and create as many birds as they can, then attack the Dovescape player to get the Dovescape off the board, because that's the only interaction that they have. So if you have a means of getting a Tabernacle, I don't run Tabernacle in this list, but that's often coupled with Dovescape, some way of keeping those birds off of the table, then that allows that. It makes the Dovescape to be much more intractable for your opponents. So being able to have a Dovescape and an Elish Norn just makes it lights out. And for the decks that don't care about Dovescape, like Najeela, then Elish Norn makes it almost impossible for them to figure out a way through.
Right. Oh, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think it's very interesting because, we talk about these differences, especially, we're talking about the Sun Titan, the Elish Norn, but I think very interestingly, of the three of you, and correct me if I'm wrong, Pongo, yours is probably the slimmest of the three when it really comes to win packages.
Yeah, so pretty recently, I think I even slimmed down even further, so that might be why Fenix thought that I was playing a few extra combo pieces.
Yeah.
But it's been I don't know, over a week or 2 weeks, I think, now that I've slimmed down on that package a bit. So essentially, my philosophy in general is that I like to optimize around my openers, and so I generally shy away from cards that I find awkward in my opening hands, preferring to have as much as possible cards that are going to sort of bridge the gap from the early game into the later game for me. And I just feel like we're inherently so favored in that later game as is, that it's, at least in my opinion, it's less crucial to be focusing on those top end finishers. We kind of already have everything that we need as far as I'm concerned, just in Kenrith and a few of the other big sort of top end pieces that we kind of just want to play in general. Beyond that, I keep a pretty slim sort of win package of Emil and just dockside. As far as infinite mana is concerned, yes, that leaves a certain weakness to, like something like a Null Rod effect. But as far as I'm concerned, if there's a deck at the table playing Null Rod, that plays very well to our strengths in general anyway. And I'm more than happy to just lean on Kenrith, I think, at that point to beat people down, win the game, and sort of take advantage of the fact that other people at the table are playing stacks, and that sort of we are going to hardlock them out of the game so that they're not going to be able to win, and we're going to have a much better plan in the command zone than they could possibly have.
Right. No, and I think this is interesting, and this is something that I really want to touch on, because I think what this highlights specifically is how, first of all, how versatile the list can be. Right. We've got three different takes on this where, we kind of got different spins, and it can really be tooled to the different play styles, right? Where, it's very easy to look at, like Cobblepott, a lot of your lists, you really like to layer your wins around all sorts of different stuff. And then you look at maybe somebody like Pongo, for instance, where it's just very slim, very compact. And then you have Fenix, who's somewhere in the middle. And I just think it's interesting to highlight how your play style does impact the construction of the deck, but ultimately it's like the same thing, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, sorry, Cobble.
Go for it, Pongo.
I just had a quick point. I would say also, there's certainly meta considerations as well.
Right.
I could see myself within a certain play group, for example, or within certain expected matchups, being far more okay with like leaning into more top end. Right now, I like to build my lists kind of with the assumption of like the worst, which is that I might get, paired off against like three really fast decks, and that kind of some of the narrower pieces might not necessarily be relevant. So, I do like to build my lists kind of with a not a pessimistic view, but kind of a particular view of what I'm expecting to see, rather than a like generalist kind of like catch all, have a toolbox for possibly any possible situation, but having that toolbox potentially giving up some percentage points in like the very worst cases.
What were you Pongo, you had a point. What was it you wanted to touch on?
So that was my point.
All right, excuse me. I meant Cobblepott. I was
consideration.
looking at the wrong thing in the screen.
No, I think that's pretty close to what I was going to say, where meta considerations are going to cause you to devote slots to either if you've got a meta that's really saturated with a certain type of hate or a certain commander, or that you're going to see one particular style of gameplay more often than others, then that's going to cause you to maybe be a little bit more generous in your slot designations for pieces that are going to interact more profitably for you against those particular decks. And I think that could possibly be part of kind of some of the nuances and differences that you're seeing across the lists.
Right. And so kind of moving to the next portion of this, right? And this is something, Cobblepott, you and I had discussed last week, was this difference between win cons and combos, and how combos are this, combination, not to be silly with my word choice, of cards that enable you to win the game. So we're looking at here, we've got kind of all these different combos, some of them that overlap. Draneth Magistrate, Lavinia, a rule of law effect. One interesting thing that I think is very interesting, all three of you, and I think it was Cobblepott who initiated this, are playing Possibility Storm with all of this. And I think that was one of the texts that I saw, and I was like, oh my gosh, that makes total sense. Cobblepott, if you want to go through some of the win cons here combos here for us.
Sure. So, like you were just saying, Possibility Storm is one of those things that just happens to fit very well in a shell that is devoting a lot of resources to kind of a rule of law plan. So because of the fact that in the past year we've gotten at least 2 additional rule of law effects that we've kind of added to the repertoire, that makes a kind of a game plan that's built around it much more consistent, just because you have more of those available to you. But being able to build in these different types of locks that kind of accentuate the imparity that you have with your opponents when you get, for instance, a rule of law plus a Possibility Storm, or much more profitably a Draneth Magistrate or a Lavinia with a Possibility Storm. Those wind up being really, really good additions to the lists. Mm-hmm. So my particular list is a lot of the engine pieces are built around creatures that can advance your board state without requiring you to cast any spells. So because of the fact that we want to be able to get the game into a situation where people can either only cast one spell, you're throttling them, or people can't cast any spells at all, situations where you've got Possibility Storm or Dovescape or those kinds of things, you still want to be able to be active, and Kenrith is a great way to kind of maintain that. But in my particular list, I'm running Yisan and Birthing Pod and Fiend Artisan and Academy Rector. And Academy Rector, which used to just be a piece that was mainly about getting Dovescape into play, and in an earlier incarnation of the list, getting Living Plane into play, it wound up being, because it's so strong, because Possibility Storm is so strong with the other pieces that we were already playing, namely Lavinia and Draneth Magistrate, it made sense since Academy Rector very easily is able to pivot and kind of get you the big lock piece that makes the most sense for the certain circumstance that you're looking at. Sometimes if you've got a Drannith Magistrate or you've got a Rule of Law on the table, then you just go and you get a Possibility Storm onto the battlefield. If you don't have one of those already, then just throwing a Dovescape into the middle of the field is going to cause most CEDH decks to have a lot of trouble being able to put together anything that looks remotely like what their normal game plan is. So being able to get either one of those off of something like an Academy Rector is a big motivating factor for having those there. And because of the fact that we have so many of these pieces, I think all three of the decks are running Fiend Artisan. Mine might be the only one that's running Rector and Yisan and Birthing Pod. All of those are engine pieces that can kind of let you select the thing that you need, the piece of hate that you need to lock down the specific decks that you're playing against at a very kind of precise time. So once you got Fiend Artisan, you can very, very, you've kind of got surgical control over being able to say, I need to go and get Drannith Magistrate right now, or I need to go and get Dockside, and I need to win right now. Having the flexibility to be able to just put the thing that you need into play through a Possibility Storm, or through a Rule of Law, and have that not count as your casted spell for the turn is a really powerful dynamic to be able to bring to the table, because it allows you just to continue your game plan while everybody else is kind of stuck at something that is parity with each other but not parity with you.
Right. No, and so we go through all that. One of the combos that's on there, help me understand this. I feel like I kind of understand how it is, but just for clarification. So Fenix, all three of you have the Dockside Phantasmal Image plus Kenrith combo. Explain what is going on there for me.
Yeah, so the situation that this is... so these combination of cards work even if you, say, have played a Dockside to power out your Kenrith or something like that. So the Dockside just needs to be on the battlefield. You can get it there from the graveyard with Kenrith's ability, things like that. And then if Kenrith is out and you have enough mana off of the Dockside trigger, you can play Phantasmal Image as a copy of Dockside. And then once you've made enough treasures, I think it's 6? I don't remember off the top of my head.
I think you need 8 to make it infinite.
I think it is 8 for it.
Yeah, because you need to spend 5 to reanimate. You need 2 to target the Phantasmal Image with the +1/+1 ability, and then you need to net 1.
Yeah, so 8. So then what you do is you use the Kenrith's +1/+1 ability, like Pongo said, and you target the Phantasmal Image, which triggers the Phantasmal Image, and then it goes to the graveyard. And then you use the reanimate ability from Kenrith to put the Phantasmal Image back on the battlefield as a copy of the Dockside Extortionist.
That's kind of what I thought was going on, but I wanted to make sure I wasn't like, I think that's how that works. So correct me if I'm wrong, that's very situational, because that's going to require, there are, you said 8, right, Cobble? There's either needs to be 8,
treasures
it needs to be able
per
to
loop.
produce 8 treasures per loop in order for it to work.
Right.
Okay.
But it's more compact than it's more mana compact on your side than MEL plus Dockside, which is 6+3 as opposed to 4+2. So if you're in a situation where you're able to where the table affords it, and a lot of times the table will afford it depending on the metagame that you're in. It's not that hard to get to 8 treasures per loop. It's slimmer in its startup cost than the MEL plus Dockside loop happens to be. And also, Phantasmal Image, depending on your metagame, is going to be really flexible for... a lot of times when people, especially if you're a Kenrith person, getting your Kenrith Gilded Draked feels really bad, but then you have a Phantasmal Image to go and copy the Gilded Drake and get your Kenrith back, and then you put +1/+1 counter on the Gilded Drake, and then it dies, and then you can reuse it for other circumstances and stuff like that. So it kind of winds up being this Swiss Army knife of whatever you need to copy that's on the board to be able to gain advantage, and then whenever you need to reclaim it to become a dockside, you just put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then you're off to the races. So it's very flexible in that way, and none of those things require a cast again. So you can do all of that stuff without impacting your rule of law quota, or you can do it through possibility storm and all that.
And that was something we had mentioned too. I know we talked about this last time we were on. Is the fact that Phantasmal, we're playing CDH. Odds are we aren't playing bad creatures. So Phantasmal Image really is able to be whatever we need it to be given the situation. We kind of touched on this a little bit, but everybody's kind of got these different key cards. So Pongo, when we're talking about your list, what are some of the more important key pieces, infrastructure with that deck that you would say?
So I would say sort of where there's sort of core differences in my build and Fenix's build sort of by extension is more in the inclusion of stack-based interaction alongside the permanent-based disruption. So what I'm really building towards is the actual fairly powerful synergy between counter spells and rule of law effects. If you're in a situation where you've got a rule of law effect in play and you happen to have a commander that can seriously pressure people, or you just happen to be ahead otherwise, you don't necessarily need to commit more to the board from that point on. However, if you happen to have counter spells in hand, no one's going to be able to send removal at your hate pieces or your lock pieces without you having some say in the matter in return. So not only do these cards let you sort of bridge the early game, protect you from very, very fast wins by interacting on the stack, but they also later on allow you to protect your board. And I do think that this deck, particularly against some of the faster ad nauseum decks, is going to be able to develop a board very rapidly that puts them on a very quick clock, and from that point on really just wants to protect it against whatever they're going to plan on doing to disrupt or to break out of your disruption. It's sort of an analogous idea to vintage decks playing Deafening Silence for their paradoxical outcome, or Doomsday matchups, because the second that they try to go to remove your Deafening Silence, you force of will back, and it's over. You've said, I've decided what's happening now. Admittedly, the dynamic's a little different in multiplayer. And that's where I also bring in, I think pieces that are common to all of us, sort of a lot of these permanent-based pieces that are also going to either protect you during your turn, so things like Grand Abolisher, things like Vexing Shusher. Vexing Shusher also protects you on other people's turns, but also Sylvan Safekeeper that is capable of protecting your hate pieces in play. These things are an additional layer of protection that make it so that you can kind of still be holding up your counter magic to interact profitably with what your opponents are going to be trying to do to break out of your lock. Bridge that early game, and then also just make it sort of really unrealistic, or as unrealistic as possible, that people are able to break out of your lock.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because we were talking before we got into it with Cobblepott. And I noticed the you and Pongo and Fenix are on counter magic. You guys are running. It's certainly a slimmer, right, counter suite than most control or stacks lists might play, running 22 and 23 instants respectively. But then I move over and I see Cobblepott's list, and I see 11 instants, and the only counter in the deck is Mental Misstep. That was a very conscious choice, wasn't it?
Well, yeah. So my list is like I was saying before. One of the main kind of arcs of the list is to be keeping people off of instants and sorceries, or keeping people off of non-creature spells that are 1 CMC and 2 CMC and 3 CMC when possible. The idea being that if you can get a chalice on 1, and you can get a sanctum prelate on 2, or if you can get a sanctum prelate on 1 and then copy it with a phantasmal image on to cover a couple of the the low CMCs, that winds up being a really intractable place for a lot of the CEDH metagame to be able to play against, just because if you run the numbers and you look at the non-creature spells that they have in those slots, just shutting off 1 CMC is gonna hit about 50% of the action that most of the decks are going to be running. And if you hit 1 and 2 CMC, then it's up to about 75%. So because that is a main line in my list, and because Dovescape is in there as well, with the intent of forcing people to not be able to play on those axes, I'm protecting my own stuff along that using Allosaurus Shepherd and Destiny Spinner and Vexing Shusher, so I can kind of break parity with my permanents and be able to get enchantments down through a Dovescape, or be able to get green spells through the a chalice, depending on what particular number it's on. It isn't profitable when that is as deep of an aspect of the game plan to run things like Swan Song and even Swords to Plowshares and the 1 CMC instant interaction. And by taking those things out, then you see that slimming down of what's taking place there. So Mental Misstep stayed just because it's something that is not card disadvantage and is useful enough, often enough on turn 1 to be able to disrupt some problematic first turn plays that is still there. But Force of Will, there's not enough blue cards in the deck to warrant being able to keep that in hand, because a lot of the times you won't be able to cast it for free just because of the partitions that are there, and there's not enough blue that's in there to support it with a high enough percentage to be a profitable card to run. So,
Right.
And I've found that doubling down on being able on the cards that say that nobody can cast anything and nobody can cast any instance at this, either no instance at all or no instances at 1 and 2. I haven't missed that type of interaction that's at that casting cost, just because I'm still running things like Submerge and Force of Vigor and the higher CMC interaction that you can cast for free when you need to.
Right.
And if you really need to cast it, then there's always a Vexing Shusher to be able to push it through.
Right. So I circle back now. So Pongo, you and Fenix are running this instant what's the word, counter suite. But very interestingly, of the three of you, specifically between you and Pongo, you have 7 counter spells in the deck as it stands right now. Fenix, you are running 9. Go through that selection, because interestingly, this specifically, because I'm going to contrast this to Pongo, for a moment, because you guys run a lot of the same stuff, Dispel, Swan Song, Force of Will, those sorts of things. But you very uniquely are running Dovin's Veto, Flusterstorm, Red Elemental Blast. What was the thought process in putting those 3 in specifically?
Yeah, so those are in exactly what Cobble was just saying, to bridge the early game. I feel like a lot of the bad matchups are things that are faster than us, and the things that are faster than us are usually trying to cast some sort of combo, Consultation or Oracle underneath our Rule of Law before we can get it down, or cast Ad Nauseam as fast as possible. And so Dovin's Veto is specifically in for Ad Nauseam. Somebody tries to play Ad Nauseam and protect it, you Dovin's Veto, and unless they have something that makes it uncounterable, it loses. Flusterstorm is probably the most contentious because we are playing Rule of Laws, and Flusterstorm is a very bad counterspell when there are Rule of Laws. And then the Red Elemental Blast is just another 1 CMC counter just to get us up to 9.
And it can also work specifically kind of as a removal spell if need be, though, too.
Yep, exactly. So it's a little bit more flexible than the other ones. Flusterstorm would maybe be the strongest against some of those faster decks, but then not quite so good once the game drags on a little bit for us, which is usually the opposite of how Flusterstorms works. But
right. And then Pongo, you've got the Force of Will, Pact of Negation, but you are also running Force of Negation. What is the reasoning for running Force of Negation?
Yeah, so I mean that could just as easily be like a Dovin's Veto type effect, for example. As far as I'm concerned, because this deck's game plan does put in a position where you frequently find yourself not spending all your mana on your own turn, frequently passing with like a good amount of mana, either with the intention of activating Kenrith or because you're just not able to really deploy cards with a high velocity. Something like a Force of Negation. You can reasonably cast it for 3 mana in a good number of situations, but obviously that's not the point. The point is just to, like Fenix was saying, be able to bridge the early game, have some interaction options, while being able to develop early on. This deck is not running as many rituals and fast mana as a lot of the other decks in the format are. I think that it's a little bit more sluggish to sort of get its game plan up and running. So I do think that given that, it is prudent to be, mulliganing for hands that are able to disrupt early on, as early as turn 1, ideally turn 1. Obviously, turn 2 is acceptable in the majority of situations. And having cards like Force of Negation, Force of Will, even with a relatively low blue card count. In my case, I'm on, I think, 17 blue spells, which is certainly on the lower end of what I would consider acceptable. You're mulliganing for the ability to make sure that you're going to be able to develop much more of your disruptive game plan. And again, I think that there's a lot of power in being able to be proactive and still also be able to hold up some kind of interaction.
Well, and this is kind of an interesting bridge into kind of where we're going next, because you speak about like mulliganing, and it kind of comes down to the whole how do you play the deck? What are things you need to know and think about with the deck? So really, Cobblepott, when we're talking about playing the deck, what are some important lines that you really feel like, and we'll start off with your deck, that people should really think about when they're playing this list?
So, I mean, what I think for probably all 3 lists is going to hold is that you want to be looking at your opponent. You want to be considering what lines are going to be expected from your opponents, and you want to find the hate pieces that are going to keep your as many opponents or the most threatening opponent off of their lines as early as you can. And all 3 of the lists are running a good amount of dorks and some modest artifact ramp and that kind of thing. So a lot of times you can mulligan yourself to be able to have some acceleration in hand and be able to have a choice of maybe 1 or 2 hate pieces in hand, or at least having a tutor to be able to go and find an appropriate hate piece that is going to be impactful. A lot of times that's going to be a Rule of Law effect. You want to be you don't want to be looking a lot of the time as as the case is for a lot of the faster decks, they're looking for the win as fast as you can. Find the win, get the win. Really, what you want to be doing here is you want to have an idea of what your win is going to be, but you also want to keep everybody else off of their win, and that's actually your highest priority. So if you've got an early, for mine, if I've got an Imperial Seal in my opening hand, and I don't have a Rule of Law effect, then I'm probably going to be looking for either a Deafening Silence or a Chalice of the Void, and get one of those things, get that onto the board as on turn 2 if possible. You also want to be looking at the things that are going to allow you to be able to operate through the Rule of Law. So the counter magic is only going to be helpful in disrupting other people's lines when a Rule of Law is on the table. If there's a Rule of Law on the table and you want to cast a spell, you won't be able to use your counter magic to support it. And that's part of why I don't really run as any of the counter magic is instead you want to be on, if you can find an early Vexing Shusher, or you can find an early Allosaurus Shepherd or something like that that's going to protect your pieces as they're coming onto the board, that is also going to help to be able to have more predictability in making sure that you're going to be disrupting people's plans. Sometimes those things are going to get removed. Yeah, that's true. But then that's something that your opponents are spending their time on, and they're losing tempo on their own game plans because they're spending their resources instead on trying to get you off of disrupting them. So I don't know if you guys want to talk more to the types of things that you're looking at. If you've got a vampiric tutor, what's the first thing that you're going to look for based on what your opponents are doing?
Yeah, I mean, like Pongo, what is that's a great question. What is your first tutor really for the list?
It's in a vacuum a little bit difficult to answer, but Drannith Magistrate obviously being one of the bigger targets. I think, why Fenix's deck is aptly named. It's got very, very broad disruptive potential. I also think, Opposition Agent now is a very, very strong contender for the type of card that I would. I mean, I'm trying it out. I'm pessimistic. I'm trying it out everywhere, but I'm pessimistic. But I'm still trying it out literally everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like what's it called? Even Mind Sensor. I mean, Even Mind Sensor already does that. It's no big deal, right? And it flies.
It's Even Mind Sensor in worse color, right?
Yeah.
Come on, it doesn't fly. Come on.
No, Opposition Agent is obviously a stupid card. I can't really mince words about that. So I do think that, Drannith Magistrate, very, very, I would say one of the bigger tutor targets, Opposition Agent, Archon of Emeria as well. Essentially, like, really strong 2019-2020 cards are pretty much always going to be, my turn 1 tutor targets.
2019 and 2020 definitely gave you some good ones. So you got that. One line, and I want to bring this up because I did this in a game to Fenix with this deck. I won the game, and I love doing it. So I want you to go over. So there's this really unique thing. We were talking about kind of the differences in the deck, different lines you want to take. You are the only one on Sun Titan. What is the line around that? What's the logic behind that?
Yeah, so I mean, even specifically in that game, I was playing an earlier version of this deck, and you were playing an earlier version of Cobblepott's Fair Magic. Eventually, that game came down to the fact that there was a Sun Titan out, there was a Rule of Law out, and there was a Drannith Magistrate out. And you can kill a Drannith Magistrate and try and cast your commander, but there's a Rule of Law, and then you can try and kill the Sun Titan, but then there's still a Rule of Law and a Drannith Magistrate out, and so on and so forth. The Sun Titan is recursion for the hate pieces, and also doubles as a beater. So when the game slows down, the Sun Titan just eventually gets all of those hate pieces that people have dealt with throughout the game and puts them back out.
And then there's the unique interaction with that. You and Pongo are both playing Sylvan Safekeeper, but there's the unique interaction with that, and I found that with playing that list. Once you get Sun Titan out and you start doing this and you have lands to dispose and you have a Sylvan Safekeeper, it's going to be hard to get rid of that Sun Titan and anything else you put on the board after that.
And yeah, exactly. The Sylvan Safekeeper with Sun Titan makes most of your creatures immune to spot removal. So in CEDH, we're not playing a lot of things that really deals with something like that. We're playing a lot of efficient spot removal, deal with the one thing that is stopping me from winning. And so the Sylvan Safekeeper definitely stops people from playing those cards and stopping you from stopping them in that case.
Right. Now, I've talked a lot about differences between the deck, and we're going to come back to that because there's still some differences, specifically with Cobblepott, that I want to talk about. But interestingly enough, all three of you have the same 6 sorceries, no more, no less. Demonic Tutor, Diabolic Intent, Eldritch Evolution, Finale of Devastation, Imperial Seal, and Neoform. I mean, I don't even know who to ask about this because all three of you came to the same conclusion. So I guess, I mean, if I'm thinking Pongo. So if we're talking about, so why are these 6 specifically?
It's a simple answer. I mean, first of all, tutors are just very, very good to have.
Yes.
And you kind of want to run a lot of tutors. I think that pretty much anyone who's played CEDH knows that our decks, as much as possible, are slim win conditions with like just a ton of tutors to support that. But going a little bit beyond that, there is this issue of sorceries not being particularly good in our deck because when you often only get to cast one spell per turn. You don't have very high card velocity, so you prefer to be playing more instants or things that you can put into play at instant speed. So essentially, I think that's probably that's probably the conclusion we all kind of land on with that. Additionally, what other sorceries do you really want to run? Like,
or maybe put a different way, probably the sorcery that's conspicuously missing here that you see often played in other CEDH decks is Toxic Deluge, and that's because we're on Hate Bears, and that's not really the card that we want. We want to be on removal that's going to be more asymmetric, and in this particular case, all 6 of those cards are tutors, and all 6 of those cards are able to get us the proactive answers for what it is that we want to be putting onto the table.
Well, and I was just thinking about this too, Cobblepott, because Eldritch Evolution in your deck has this really fun interaction where you can sack the Academy Rector to it and get both pieces to a potential lock out of that one cast.
Right. There's actually a number of cards. You can do the same thing with Fiend Artisan. There's a number of lines there where the card that sacrifices Academy Rector allows the Rector to go and get Possibility Storm, and then the creature that you or the tutor that you're using to do the sacrificing goes and gets Drannith Magistrate to make it a hard lock. So that's very
Lavinia, don't leave my girl out of it.
Right. I mean, most of the time you're gonna prefer to do Drannith Magistrate just because it means that your opponents can't cast anything at all, and most of the time that is going to be enough to get people to scoop.
Right. Well, and I mean, even in Lavinia, let's be real, Drannith Magistrate is much better than Lavinia, right? Phoenix,
I mean, so a lot of times Lavinia. So a lot of people look at Lavinia through the lens of, well, yeah, she's a combo piece. She's part of this lock, but just having a naked, well, just putting Lavinia out onto the table, even turn 1, will turn off people's ability to put rocks down that are free rocks. It keeps people off of all if you're in a variant of this list, so the old version of this list ran Living Plane. So if you had like Living Plane with Elish Norn and people didn't have any lands, well, it keeps them off of being able to cast any spells because they have no lands. Those kinds of things. She has a lot of value outside of that lock that I think people kind of gloss over just because the lock is so powerful. So people kind of only and we talked about this long ago, talking about functional fixedness, where it's like, well, this is what she does. Her thing is she's a lock piece. It's like, no, that she has other value beyond that. And go ahead.
Well, and one of the things with it that I think is really interesting, because you bring up the land piece of this, which I feel like is the part of her that people forget the most, or over pay attention to, and go, oh, you got to run Armageddon, you got to run Ravagers of War, which, to be fair, Fenix and I both do. But one of the pieces to it that I think is really important, especially in the current meta, is it slows Turbo Nas way, way down. Because Turbo Nas can't go ritual ad nauseum and go into it, or land or like what am I trying to get at? Artifacts.
Peer into the abyss is a lot harder to get off the ground too.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I just want to speak to Koppel's point, because I agree thoroughly. To put it succinctly, in my opinion, Lavinia's stock has gone way up recently. We've just gotten a new 0, Jeweled Lotus, right? Like, if you can get Lavinia down turn 1 and you're on the play off of a Chrome Mox or something, and somebody was really counting on that Jeweled Lotus to give them a really explosive start, great. Right. That's already one extra 0 that people are running. People are running Fierce Guardianship. People are running Deflecting SWAT. People are now running Roger, Rogrick. That's going to be a major, major part of the meta.
Oh, I hadn't even thought about that.
Turns out that you can't actually cast him if Lavinia's in play. Obviously, all of these 0s require that you get Lavinia down first for the most part. But, I think what we're seeing is this kind of increasing trend of like free spells or, alternate casting cost spells. All these things that Lavinia is sort of increasingly powerful against. And additionally, as you both were touching upon, she's also just really, really good against ad nauseum. I think she's a case of another hate piece that was being held back by the dominance of Flash Hulk. Right. And now that we're in a ad nauseum meta, Lavinia gets substantially better. Right.
Well, in Fenix and I, because we run the Omen Pool meta, when Flash was a thing, and especially when Thassa's Oracle came out, we were just straight up telling people in the Discord, do not play this deck right now. Like, it's bad. And then it gets banned, and then Dan gets printed, and then all of a sudden we're like, oh, hey, the deck's suddenly really good.
Changes just that quickly.
Yeah. But, no, that is a good point. But, we're talking to... I have a soft spot for Lavinia. If I were going to tutor, just because I've loved this... nobody when you're listening to this, you won't be able to see this, but for the people who are in the group chat with me right now, you'll see I have a Lavinia poster right behind me. Mm-hmm. I like that card. But so we talked about some of those similarities. Mana bases, there are some differences, like Phyrexian Tower that Cobblepott has. I'm assuming that's some sort of interaction with Academy Rector. Am I incorrect? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
So you have that, mild differences, which, actually not even mild. It's really just the difference between Fenix and Pongo's mana base and Cobblepott's mana base. Because Fenix, I'm willing to bet you just straight up copied Pongo's mana base.
Yeah, we have perfect 5-color mana.
I would be interested to hear why you guys are not running Ancient Tomb, being on a Kenrith deck.
Do you want to answer this, or?
I think you can go for it.
Yeah, so basically, it's mainly just a question of the deck being extremely hungry for colored mana, having like sort of really stringent colored mana requirements for pretty much most of the spells in the deck. It is a card I have given some thought to, because obviously, we do have kind of a higher curve than the average deck. So, if you do get a hand with like 3 lands in it, 2 sort of let's say dual lands that have that cover 4 different colors and Ancient Tomb, you're often going to be okay in that position. But no, most of the time I'm mulliganing aggressively for ideally like a turn 1 piece of interaction. And since I'm not playing, for example, Chalice of the Void, I have even one fewer thing that I'm going to be powering out with my Ancient Tomb turn 1, as far as really strong disruptive options are concerned.
I mean,
yeah,
a Chalice on turn 1 it feels really good.
Yeah, I can imagine.
As a modern player, I can confirm this. So the mana base is the mana base, right? You're all running Gaia's Cradle. You're all running very similar things. When it comes to that, one of the interesting things here, and this is something that I wanted to point out, I really want to touch on, is Cobblepott. You're playing Ashiok Dreamrender and Oko Thief of Crowns.
Yes. So Ashiok is eventually going to turn into opposition agent, but
Right.
Ashiok and Mind Sensor have been in there for a long time. Leon and Arbiter was also in there for a period. The idea is that when you're running a list that is very oriented around hate permanence, the way that your opponents are going to interact with them, especially if you've got kind of a very diverse portfolio of hate, so you're going to have creatures and enchantments and artifacts that are going to be stifling their game plan in different ways, it's unlikely most of the time that they're going to have the response that they need in hand to be able to unseat whatever hate that is so that they can move forward with their game plan. So the expectation is that's okay most of the time. I'll tutor for the thing that I need so that I can find the removal that I need to get back onto my game, which is why in proactive, permanent-oriented hate lists, things that hate on tutors are much more powerful, because not only are you depriving of your opponents of being on their desired game plan, you're also depriving them of being able to find a response to get back once you've put them into that situation. So that is the explanation for Ashiok.
And we're going to touch on some of these new cards that are coming out of this new set, because I know we're doing a set review that'll be coming out Wednesday. The interesting thing with Opposition Agent is it's really interesting, because it's like if you take Ashiok, Aven Mind Sensor, and Praetor's Grasp and just kind of shove them all together, and you kind of end up getting this really twisted, disgusting amalgamation of a card.
I think it's beautiful.
Yes, I mean, it's very good. Listen, I'm like Rebel. I played. I had built a 5 colors to say consultation list that is now just boned, and I'll probably never be able to play it again. So I'm a little sad. But like I said, we'll talk about it a little bit more on Wednesday. But so Ashiok kind of, like you said, is really filling that role right now, and so that's like going to be Opposition Agent, you said?
Probably.
Okay.
That's the thing that I'm most likely to slot out in order to put Opposition into the list.
Okay. And then with Oko, Oko is
Oko.
It's amazing. So
right. So this is something that we already know, and I mean, through the lens of Opposition Agent, this is something that's going to become more prevalent. Is that a lot of lists really don't run enough interaction. And when I'm saying interaction, what I'm meaning here is spot removal, or removal that is flexible for being able to get rid of different types of disruption. And my list is running Oko, and it's also running the new creature Skyclave Apparition. Both of those are just very, very flexible to deal with whatever somebody comes up with, whether it's their commander, whether it is a hate piece that is really poisonous to what we want to be doing. Oko in particular is just great just because it's repeatable every single turn until somebody finally does something about it. It's a much better in CEDH than I think a lot of people give it credit for. I would probably rate it higher than Gilded Drake in a lot of cases, and I understand the
That's a pretty hot take.
I understand the impact of what saying that kind of connotes, but it's especially moving into a metagame where opposition agent is going to be a thing. One, people will need to either be running more removal to be able to get it off the table so that they can be playing their games, and two, they're just going to need to play their tutors differently. So
now, and it's important to note, because there was something that came to the forefront, at least in the judge community, when Oko was printed, where if you Oko a Magus of the Moon, all non-basics are still mountains, which is hilarious. However, I will like to point out that with the layering, I'm almost 100% positive, because of the wording on opposition agent, if you Oko it, that will go away.
Yes.
Yeah, we would have to look at layers, like typesetting effects for lands, for example. It would take place, I think, before the Oko typesetting effect occurs for the case of Magus of the Moon. And yeah, I'm not 100% sure, because I haven't really actually thought about it, but I think you're right about opposition agent.
This is something I want to revisit on Wednesday a little bit more, because I do think it's relevant. Because especially with, Oko being in this deck, it's in other decks I know that's starting to become a little bit more popular. I'm curious, and I'm going to do some research. I'm going to talk to some judge friends in Slack and find this out for that episode specifically. But my curiosity is if the first part of the you control sticks around, but the exile does not. I'm really curious. I don't think it does, but I'll try to get a definitive answer for us for our set review. And like I said, that's coming out on Wednesday. So we played Oko. Like you said, Cobblepott, it kind of fills a lot of roles, that spot removal.
It has a minus ability too, so when your opponents do play that opposition agent, that's a thing.
Take it.
Yeah, I think actually, this kind of probably goes to it speaks to maybe some philosophical differences that my list has from Cobble's, and I imagine Fenix's as well by extension. I guess I would probably say that I'm just generally more pessimistic. So in my experience, like, planeswalkers are not as reliable as I would like. If people want them gone, people will tend to collude, essentially, to remove them from the battlefield. I've seen that time and time again with effects like Narset. I've seen that time and time again with effects like Ashiok, even Oko to a certain extent. Now, obviously, in this list, that may be less the case, because obviously this deck, has a 5/5 commander that can protect them pretty well. Additionally, it has quite a high number of creatures which can protect them a little bit better. But beyond that, I also find that they tend to not do things in the time frame that I'm most concerned about, which is, again, returning to this early game issue. There's also just kind of this idea that I'm mostly concerned about right now addressing sort of the, let's say, the big bad of the meta, which is kind of like these Turbo style decks. And, I don't know that an effect like Oko necessarily does enough, in my opinion, to deal with that matchup. So it's a good tool to have, but I don't know that it's a tool that I necessarily want to have in my toolbox personally. Additionally, I think that, one of the big differences that we see is that Cobble's list runs a lot of cards that interact well with one another, which, I do think that, like, the synergy-based approach is, it has high potential upside, but obviously you run the risk of it either not happening on sort of the time frame that you're most concerned about. So for me, that's the concern, is that There's like a certain time frame at which I'm most concerned about surviving, and I don't want to have I don't want to have to draw into these pieces that are mostly applicable a bit later on. So again, like I said, I think I take a pessimistic approach. And also, I do think that one thing that I'm not sure, I think one thing I disagree with Cobblepott, I think more directly with, is the point about people playing removal. I think actually people are playing way more removal for creatures now than ever kind of before, because people, not like hard removal, but people are playing a lot of bounce effects because comboing with dockside is such a major part of the meta game right now. So there is a lot of creature removal in particular.
While that seems like it's possible, I was talking to Mike Levine about this with respect to the most recent tournament, the Oktoberfest, and how that was it was very clear that in that particular subset, that particular sample, removal was very, very underrepresented, and that might just be because that was a particular subset of decks that were kind of clustered around trying to all be fast gnaws, and they weren't necessarily on dockside or whatever. But he was noticing that there was he was in almost every case the only person who was policing the table with creature removal and so on, and that was actually part of how he was able to it helped him with his percentage at the tables, he was noticing. So I think that it's hard to speak in universal terms about the CEDH meta when we're so siloed across so many little islands.
I agree
and
with
ponds.
that. Yeah.
So this kind of is very interesting, and I kind of, man, we could probably do just a meta analysis, honestly. But there's, we've talked about opposition agent, and obviously that has sparked some debate, especially around the idea of removal and all of that. But we're also talking about some new cards, and that's something I want to touch on here briefly. And I know we've gone on for an hour and a half, and hopefully I'm not taking too much of your guys' time with this.
No, we're good.
We're talking about these newer cards, so we talked about opposition agent, right? There's another card that's a Notion Thief-esque type card that was just announced in the past few days too, of Hull Breacher. And Hull Breacher, and we're going to address this again, like I said, really breaking down the quality of the card and all those things. Is this a card that this run at, like Fenix, in your list, would you think about running this?
Probably not. I think that, speaking of that card specifically, I think it works the best when you are playing wheel effects in your deck. Mm-hmm. You can replace Lion's Eye Diamond in a Breach combo with it, and we can maybe leave that for a set review, but I don't think that the card has enough inherent synergy to value playing over anything else. It does stop card draw, which is something that I don't have a ton of effects in this deck for.
And it does generate mana, which is important, especially in a deck like this. And so, and I'll toss that same question over to Pongo. Would you consider this card in that list?
I think into the right metagame, I would absolutely consider running it.
So, what metagame specifically, then, would you be thinking about?
So, in particular, I would be considering running this against decks that are themselves trying to leverage a lot of wheels. Mm-hmm. Obviously, at that point, it's a super powerful disruptive piece because people are, a lot of the time going to be playing this game plan of kind of dumping their hand of mana and wheeling. If you can get this down quickly enough, then you can kind of disrupt that game plan. I guess, I still do agree with Fenix that, my main issue with the card is that, hating on draw effects is not necessarily going to be a strong enough form of disruption for us to actually like it consistently bridge again that early game. If we're playing this on turn 2, it's possible that we still end up losing to end step vampiric tutor for ad nauseum, right? Where a rule of law effect would be considerably stronger in that position. So I think it's a super powerful hate bear. Certainly will always be like in my considering section of my deck list, and if I find myself in like a grindy enough situation, or I know that it's going to have particularly high value, then I'm going to certainly value it higher. The fact that we weren't playing Notion Thief already kind of leads me to think that like, okay, well, this is one less mana. It's certainly stronger in that respect, but maybe we were not that concerned about this effect to begin with.
Right. So, again, I'm just going to toss the same question over to you. Cobble, is this a maybe board card for you, or is this a card you're going, yep, this is it?
No, I don't think that I'm going to be running it. It's as both Pongo and Fenix said, we're not running any wheel effects in our lists. None of us are on even Time Twister, so we're definitely not trying to weaponize draw, which is where you're going to see opposition agent, or not opposition, where Hull Breacher be at its best.
Right.
And if you're going into a metagame where you're expecting people to be weaponizing their wheels, or you're expecting people to be on Thrasios lists, or lists that are heavily tied to some sort of engine where draw is the centerpiece of what they're trying to do, then that can warrant kind of a meta slot. But
right.
for kind of the boogeyman that's in the room ad nauseum, so it is effective against Peer into the Abyss, but it does absolutely nothing to Necropotence. It does absolutely nothing to ad nauseum. So we really do want to be maximizing the amount of profitable hate that we have against that game plan, and this is not it.
Okay. So the last card then that I really felt like we wanted to talk about then, and I'll start off asking with you, Cobb, about this, is deck's pretty slim on ramp and artifact sort of things. Not necessarily ramp. I guess we run a lot of mana dorks. So if we're talking about this, the boogeyman in the room right away, right? Everybody flipped out about Jeweled Lotus. I mean, are we putting a slot for this in here?
I don't think I'm gonna. I mean, I might test it a little bit, but my anticipation is that I was not going to prioritize putting this in the list, and that's mainly because getting Kenrith onto the board is not a priority. The priority is finding a way to be profitably interactive with what your opponents are doing, and Jeweled Lotus is not going to assist in that game plan. Sure, it'll help us to get Kenrith, down, but that's not the thing that we want to be doing on turn 1 or turn 2. And okay. I mean, if you open up with Ancient Tomb and Jeweled Lotus, and you could say, well, I could cast a turn 1 Kenrith. Most of the time you don't want to do that. That's not the thing that you want. You want to be spending your money, or you want to be spending your mana on something that's like a Deafening Silence. You want to be spending your mana on something that's going to be holding up your opponents as early as possible. So I don't think that this is something that's going to be a good fit.
All right. Fenix, you think Jeweled Lotus makes it into Secret Commander Dan?
I mean, so thinking about it, it probably has the spiciest lines in my deck, where you can do something like Jeweled Lotus Kenrith and then Neoform Kenrith into Sun Titan and get the Jeweled Lotus back to then replay the Kenrith. But even then, you're not doing something proactive enough to stop other people from winning the game. That's only winning more.
Okay.
At least in my opinion. It's still close. I don't think I would count it out without trying it, but I think that the amount of times that you draw Jeweled Lotus when you want Jeweled Lotus may influence me negatively on it. So drawing Jeweled Lotus after you have cast Kenrith, things like that, may make me not want to play it. But it's close.
Okay. And in Pongo, I feel like I kind of already know this answer because you already have it in this list. What's your opinion on Jeweled Lotus in this list?
Well, maybe you don't already know the answer, but you do know that I currently have it in the list. I actually think that Cobble and Fenix both raise excellent points. And, you know, those points, I can't really refute them. I think that, like, there is certainly tension with Jeweled Lotus in the list. That being said, the card is nutty enough to me that, like, it has to be tested, right? Like, a card that will occasionally power out a very quick Kenrith, in addition to letting us do something else potentially in that same turn, is, you know, it has very, very high potential upside. The opportunity cost remains to be evaluated, in my opinion.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting. We've got, we've been running for an hour and a half, and I don't want to take too much of your time, but I do want to touch on a few more things, because there's a couple things right here. Because y'all have kind of tried... Y'all. Can you tell what part of the country I'm from?
You're a northerner.
Yeah, that's... Well, I'm from, like, central Ohio, originally.
That's the deep south.
Central Ohio... Yeah, I've kind of always had this, like, thing, not to go too far off topic, but where, Central Ohio's in this weird spot where it's, like, kind of neatly positioned between, like, the South, Appalachia, the Atlantic area, the Midwest, and the North, and it's just kind of like this weird melting pot of things. So I kind of have some weird sayings that I'll say. But with all of that, so everybody's tried different things with this. Obviously, like Pongo was saying, he tried this all the way back, last year, where stuff before, some of the stuff had really come out yet. So some of the discarded ideas, some of the stuff you've tried, specifically in the Kenrith build, since that's what we're really talking about, that you've kind of moved on from. And, I know with Fenix, you still have Incubation Druid in. There was a time when you had Vigian Graft Mage in there as well. And so what kind of was the decision-making process for moving on from that?
So Incubation Druid is generally pretty synergistic with Kenrith because you can put a 1/1 counter on the Incubation Druid with Kenrith. Vigian Graft Mage is another opportunity to go infinite with either... I don't think any of us are playing it, but Fabro Elder or any mana dork that makes more than 3 mana, I think the ability is off the top of my head.
Tender.
Yeah,
Bloom Tender.
Technically Bloom Tender and Fabro do it, although you can't get infinite card draw. But
yeah, and so that was
large dudes.
Yeah, infinitely large dudes. You give them haste. Yeah. So generally, it's just another way that kind of layers on top of a general game plan of just powering out Kenrith to give you wins. But I found that the card was a very dead draw whenever I play tested with it, and so that's why it ended up going by the wayside.
Okay. And then Cobblepott, you had mentioned specifically the original version. You were kind of memeing on people, flashing out Archon of Valor's Reach. It made it into the Kenrith and the Fairer magic. And you cut it. So what was the decision behind that?
So in the era when Flash was still legal, the main win cons that people had were either, Flash Hulk ad nauseum, or, at the tail end of it when Oracle was printed, your Oracle plus Tainted Pact or Consultation. And during that era, if you could resolve an Archon of Valor's Reach, or you could get one, cheated into play through Natural Order or something like that, and just name instant, that was a universally strong play that was very hard for a lot of the tests in that meta, or for a lot of the different lists in that metagame to be able to overcome. And
I mean, Fenix can speak to that. We had a game in our local league where He and one of our friends were on. You were both on Shuffle Hulk or something like that, and I don't remember what I was playing. And one of the people at the table was playing
Green
what
White
was he
Sisse,
playing?
I think.
Sisse, yeah. And he brings out Archon of Valor's Reach and names instant. I was playing Yidris. That's what I was playing. Or no, I was playing Thrasios File Smasher. And y'all just what was I think it was Fenix ended up trying to wheel me into Toxic Deluge over and over again so we could get rid of it.
Right. And I mean the if in this particular set of lists was wanting to do copy effects as well, so it was never just Archon of Valor's Reach on instant, it was also on sorcery as well, and thus the removal that most people had at that point was going to be ineffectual because it's asymmetric. So if somebody Gilded Drakes one of them or something like that, they're still off of being able to cast instant sorceries. Today, that's less impactful. Now, I mean, it's still strong. If you say no one can play instants, that still is very disruptive. But there's enough lists that like Najila, like Godo, like Isan, Kenrith, depending on what variety of Kenrith you're playing against, there's enough lists that are not completely shut down by it. And also the fact that we admitted Possibility Storm into the list, it made it such that the necessity of having kind of a redundant piece to go, or not redundant, but kind of like a backup version of Dovescape was a little bit unnecessary. So pulling that out and strengthening kind of the core means we have for accelerating Dovescape or Possibility Storm into play winds up being a stronger list on the whole. And I think it's a good card. I just don't think it's as positioned as powerfully as it used to be, back in February.
Right. And then, so Pongo, what are some of the cards that you've tried out? They're all right, and you just kind of moved on from.
So certainly, Vigian Graph Mage was also in like early versions of my deck. And I kind of came to the same conclusion as Fenix, that I really didn't want necessarily to be playing a dead card, just have a little bit more win condition, like density or like redundancy for that type of thing. Mostly I just kind of wanted to, have the most consistent ability to play Rule of Law, play Possibility Storm or Knowledge Pool, and that's essentially what I decided with, sticking to that plan as much as possible was the ideal. Cards that I've cut, I mean, it's unfortunate. I don't know that I really have necessarily anything super spicy, I think, to point out, to as far as cuts. I'm constantly just tweaking cards here and there, but if I cut Dovin's Veto and replace it with something else, that's not titillating or sexy. That's just okay. You swapped one counter spell for a slightly different card. So
You're saying Dovin Veto's not sexy?
I mean, maybe him vetoing something is sexy,
right,
but
that is
the card, the card itself. I think it's the card itself is pretty okay, but again, it's kind of just like a generically good card, right? So if you're swapping it for another generically good card, at the end of the day, does that really affect people's does that really stand out to people that much? I don't think so.
Right. Well, awesome. So kind of here as we wrap up, and I'm going to make sure that we're posting each of the deck lists there. I know with Cobblepott, if you want to keep up on things that different things that you're adding to the list, I know you post about it a lot on Twitter.
Right.
But Pongo and Fenix, where is it you guys do most of this discussion? Is it in Discord? Where can people go to get in on this discussion around these decks?
I guess I'll jump into this one. I mean, you can always just at me on Twitter anytime you want to talk or DM me. It's at Team Turn 3. But, you know, where Fenix and I kind of like talk about this deck would be over at the Najeela Discord of all places. In the brewery channel. That's kind of where, you know, the craziness happens.
All right. Well, awesome. So here as we wrap up, like I said, I was promoting this. Jesus. I was promoting this earlier. We're going to be doing a set review. Fenix, are you joining for us on that? I don't remember.
No, I'm not.
Okay, so it's going to be me, Cobblepott, and Pongo. That'll be coming out Wednesday. And we're going to go down, we're going to break down the big players. Like we said, we kind of teased that a little bit. So if you want to hear more of that, make sure you like, subscribe. If you want to leave a comment, that'd be great. But, you know, if you guys want to sign off, go ahead.
Well, I think it's been real. This has been a lot of fun. It's been interesting to hear different perspectives on this is definitely a fringy kind of a list that hasn't really, gotten all that much notoriety, but I think it's got a lot of potential, and it's cool to see that we've kind of independently arrived in very similar places. And, you know, as you had said, Pongo, there's some philosophical differences there, but there's a lot that's very near the same, which I think is indicative of the fact that I think that there may be something here that is tangible, that is a recipe for success. So I'm hopeful to see kind of what happens moving forward.
Yeah, I think certainly I echo that entirely. I think that the core that is there, the core idea is definitely has legs. And then, you know, everyone kind of has their own spin on it. And I think that, ultimately, as long as the core itself is solid and, you know, like there's actually sort of a consistent workable idea there, you know, all these variations are, different spices, different, mine just happens to be flour, I guess.
I've got ghost peppers.
Ghost peppers. Oh my goodness. And then Fenix, what are your kind of closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that all of us have either Oracle or Pongo and I have Tainted Pact in our list, but we're not playing both. And it is nice to see at least some decks that are not just playing Tainted Pact and Oracle and Demonic Consultation. Interesting ways to win.
Absolutely. And I think this is something that I truly believe is I think that this is a very well-positioned deck with the way the meta is right now. We've kind of seen a lot about it, especially if you watch gameplay. Turbo farm decks, those turbo Nas decks are the thing. That's what everybody wants to play right now. Everybody's playing what's the partner pair? You were playing this, Pongo, with Roger and
Silas.
There's Silas. I mean, this is a great deck against something along those lines. So as we move forward and we're looking at where Commander Legends is going to really just shake up the meta here in a few weeks, this deck, in my opinion, is really well positioned. This deck, really just these stacks-oriented lists, even Heliod to some extent, Lavinia for sure, and Fairer Magic, this Kenrith Stax shell. I really think this is a very well-positioned list heading into the future metagame for sure. So I appreciate all you guys coming on, and we're going to get some more Cobblepott and Pongo here in the future. But thank you. This is the Mind Sculptors. Like I said, leave a like and subscribe below, and we will see you next time.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.